First of all, thank you so much for agreeing to meet with the LA Times editorial board and also with some members of our newsroom who've joined us as a courtesy. You no doubt have one of the most difficult jobs in the United States, if not the world. And we've been thinking a lot about leadership and also about accountability in recent weeks and months. But we want you to know how, how much we acknowledge the difficulty of your role. I guess I want to start with the kind of, biggest possible question, which is really the proper role of policing in our society. As a 40-year veteran of the force, you've no doubt had a lot of time to think about this.
Well, it's a complex question, so let me try to unwind a little bit of that. Thank you for the acknowledgement, and also recognizing the moment that we're in policing, as well as here in Los Angeles, in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of now tremendous calls for action with the tragic murder of George Floyd and the other acts involving police violence, and the calls for racial equity and justice, and particularly in the Black community, that a great deal of frustration that has also extended across America, and not just by ethnic identity, but by really all Americans, that this is a time for change and time for action. And with that, LAPD and LA City is, as it should be, right in the midst of it, the second largest city in the country, a global city, a world-class city, and so those, and also a very progressive city. And as such, the voices here in Los Angeles are saying not just that policing across the country, but particularly here in Los Angeles, and challenging the status quo, and also in the narrative at times is one, I think, built from frustration of a sense of that things haven't changed. And so for me, how I see this moment is one of that requires, in my view, ongoing reflection, also a resolve to not be trapped or distracted by narratives that have at times are based on advocacy for change, but using the propellant or the fuel of misinformation, or ignoring or refusing to accept that there has been an evolution in policing, not just here in Los Angeles, but across America. And I come from the place with 4 decades of work here to have seen a tremendous amount of change. And so pick the time period, whether as myself as the chief, which was in the last just over 2 years, or as the last since the Chief Bratton, go back to the civil unrest in the aftermath of Rodney King, or go back since I came on the job. There's been a steady progress, uneven at times, but steady and persistent progress of reform and change in this organization. And I believe that, but yet I also know that we're at a moment here today that further change, and we need to continue in our reforms. And I'm hopeful that the moment that we're in today is going to actually fuel lasting change in the areas of police accountability, particularly, and also in the area of investing in our Black communities and our disadvantaged, disenfranchised communities, not by taking and removing law enforcement from community safety, because I think law enforcement has an absolute role, but by challenging society's own misjudgment and over-reliance upon police and fire for matters of social health, safety, and that might mean social health, both mental health, physical health. We have 911 is a system that's been in existence now for decades, and it has become the collection basin for every social ill, every social need. And whether it's someone breaking into a home, or someone who is walking down an alley, or someone experiencing mental illness, or shortness of breath, we rely upon 911 as a society all days and times of night. I think that's partly an attribute of the fact that social services, mental health services, and physical and medical services work 9 to 5, and that we allow social programs to exist on quote unquote banker hours, versus requiring them to be in existence as we see public safety in existence, which is if policing were to say, I'm sorry, but we're off for the weekend. This is the 4th of July. No one would stand for that. But yet we allow that with outreach and engagement for homelessness, for mental health, for all types of other outreach engagements. So this moment is, to me, critical, is that I'm hopeful that this realignment of where they're asking elected officials and the public is asking for law enforcement to detangle itself from these engagements, I will absolutely welcome. I think that and I think the rank and file and the member of this organization who find themselves in convoluted circumstances that now law enforcement is being asked to solve, that we're not the right tool for that. And so I think it's what I hope is that, again, we'll see the will to change accountability here in California. What that means to me is transparency regarding law enforcement, regarding efforts of involving discipline and the outcomes of discipline. I think it means for me the ability that we have when we fire someone, that I have the ability to fire someone, not the process that I'm involved in the ability to fire someone, but the tribunal is actually held by people who may or may not be of this department, and their decision is final, and I cannot increase it. I can decrease it, which I've never been one to do, and I don't believe any of my last 2 predecessors did either. So that always seems to, the current process within the city always seems to default in favor of the officer. And I respect the rights and due process of officers, and I believe that there shouldn't be political influence and there shouldn't be the corruption that got us this system nearly 100 years ago. But the changes and adoptions that have even been made in the last 5 years have, in my view, weakened the system with the allowance of all civilian boards at the officers' actions. And I think that every study I've seen has shown that those boards are much more lenient generally than the professionals within the organization. So I think that I look for the moment to get charter change that allows us to change, to strengthen that system. It won't be perfect because as you look across American policing, there is no perfect disciplinary system. We see arbitration, we see chiefs that can hire and fire, and then they're ordered back by civil service commissions, they're ordered back by courts. But I think if nothing else, it improves the ability for the accountability of the chief of police to be responsible. I recently referred an officer who was out of policy in a shooting to a board of rights, and that officer was found not guilty. And that preempts me, and that was the only means in which I can remove that officer. And so that is, in my view, terrible. And yet I also have a situation where an officer was found, 2 officers found their last shot was found to be out of policy, that I chose not to take disciplinary action. I believe and recommended the shot was in policy. This is in the Crenshaw Mall shooting. And the Board of Police Commissioners deliberated long and hard, found that overall the shooting was in policy, except for the last 2 shots of a series of engagements with this man. And I chose not to initiate that. And I know there's people, BLM and others, that choose to focus on that and believe I should be removed. And my view in regards to that is I think the public should have a clear view of when I call balls balls and when I call strikes strikes, what actions I take, and I should be able to speak freely about it in defense of why I think that decision was right versus a different decision on a different outcome of an officer-involved shooting. And right now, a chief's ability to talk about discipline is very hampered. I can basically say that I did or did not invoke discipline. I cannot say what the penalty was. And I know chiefs across policing in California that hide behind that like a shield because they said I'm prohibited by talking whether I suspended a person or removed them. I can just, and in the worst case, they say the person's no longer employed. So the most recent changes with the budget, this call for 150 million or stopping the hiring, I've got significant concerns, not shared on by your paper, but certainly 3 hours in a budget and finance hearing, and with a great many details about what that meant, what that could mean for us. And we now have this budget, and we'll now move forward with understanding and downsizing this organization and what it does in order to meet the demands for public safety.
I ask this in humility and really on behalf of others, not in any way in rudeness. Why are you the right person to lead this department? Some would say that you came up within a system. You obviously, Chief Gates was still in office when you began as an officer. there have been calls for your resignation following the handling of the police brutality protests. You obviously apologized for misspeaking at one point, but there have been continued calls, especially as the class action lawsuit has been filed over the police response to those tense times. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, so I think that I've heard the calls. I've also heard the calls that don't support my removal as chief. My role here is not one of popularity. I recognize, though, I have to maintain. It's critical I maintain the trust of the people I serve. I serve both the communities of Los Angeles, all of the communities of Los Angeles, as well as the men and women of this organization. And in balancing those at times competing interests is one of being fair, being honest, of having a strong belief and a belief system in the core values of this organization, why it exists and how it can go about, and also recognizing with a confidence, but with not having an arrogance, that I need to reach out in all directions and find ways to do the very best job we can do in law enforcement. So why me at this time? This was a process that it was a very public process, a selection process of others that competed for it. The commission and mayor, elected officials affirmed it, and the first couple of years going at this, we've had our ups and downs, but I think I've delivered on the agenda of reform, of continued reform. LAPD didn't start in the aftermath of George Floyd with recognizing that we needed to improve as an organization, improve an organization in the sense of our diversity, building of diversity in the communities, particularly the African-American community within our membership, as well as women within our organization and Asian Pacific Islanders. That was something that didn't start in the last 60 days. We didn't start in looking at our use of force policy. We had the lowest number of officer-involved shootings last year in our recorded history. You have to go back more than 30 years. And by the way, when you go back 30 years, you'll see that those numbers exceeded over 100 officer-involved shootings each year. And yet in the last 5 years, I've been part of a reform agenda to take us from 48 officer-involved shootings down to 26. And each year that progressive reduction, I believe, is a direct attribute of the reforms that we've committed to, that I've been an architect and been involved in. And so I'm a person that believes in my heart that we can have a lot of individuals who can try to pander or identify lofty and ambitious goals. And then there are those that can have ideas of optimism and beliefs, and that we can and will become a better agency through reforms, and then sets out a course to actually accomplish it and make progress on that. And that's what I've done for my career, and I stand by it. Most recently with the civil unrest, I think that it's the aftermath of George Floyd's death and the civil and mainly peaceful protests, but also significant acts of violence, attacks on not just officers, but arson and looting and damage in major portions of the city. That story is not yet done, and I really believe that these snapshot judgments and people who want to fill a narrative are doing so unfairly.
Let me ask one more question before shifting over to Robert and some of my news site colleagues. How are you adapting your communication strategy to the age of social media? We in the media ourselves are grappling with this. These are very fraught times, and we have to take our responsibilities to inform very, very seriously. It's also a responsibility that has to kind of occur in the moment these days. I remember in the hours after you misspoke, sir, about the situation in Minneapolis, there was a lot of anger building. And I know it's hard. I know from as being a manager myself that communications can be hard. But are you, is the role of the public information officer, catching up quickly enough to the changes in our information landscape?
Yeah, I think so. I think the night that my remark, that I misspoke, first of all, I think this the very presence of the police chief with the mayor talking about the dynamics. I think you look at, if you will go back and look at news footage on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, I was very visible and in the field talking with various news accounts in an effort to communicate And that communication was not just, it wasn't just to appease elected officials or others, it was to inform the public and to give perspective of what the organization was trying to do. Those were live, many of them were live and spontaneous interviews and conversation. And the messaging was consistent, which was, we're here to facilitate lawful marches and peaceful protests. And we're doing everything we can to ensure the safety of everyone involved. And we will, however, also use proportional and progressive acts of force in order to restore order and to protect people and lives and property. And on the aftermath of my remarks, I stepped back into that. I apologize. That's today's day and time, live television, been up for 4 days. And it was a matter of, that was mischaracterization. But I think that in times past, chiefs may have just hid. That night, I posted on social media, further expounding on as much as you can, 120 characters or whatever the numbers are. But that was my personal. I make every one of my social media posts. My staff may provide me with some thoughts, and I frustrate the hell out of them because I choose not to have some of the characterizations or phrasing that they choose. But I think that in the role of policing today, the department is efforting to use social media, to use our social media accounts. And frankly, we're also dealing with a very difficult environment where anonymous and other forces are in play and trying to bury us. They're trying to, and one of the reactions, one of the things we had to deal with is in the first week was we tried to go, I won't say radio silence, but we tried not to defend the organization. We tried to get away from the aspects of everything that we have done, that this is not the Gates department. This is not the Parks department. This is LAPD in the 21st century. You might find us on President Obama's 21st century report, not just mine, but we're prominent there. That program wasn't just a cheap window dressing, that's part of our DNA. We didn't talk about our uses of force. We didn't talk about the lack of death or destruction as what we saw 30 years earlier. We didn't go into that offensive. We instead said, let's monitor this and let's not get into a war of words. So we have shifted in the last couple of weeks, and yet I'll also say that has brought upon criticism. People saying we're propaganda, we're committing propaganda. But I also say that I'm getting very tired, extremely tired and fatigued for the lack of mainland media not holding these activists accountable for their misinformation. If I hear, I don't know how many times I have to continue to hear how more than 600 people have been killed by law enforcement in LA County since 2012. An entire false narrative. There is absolute falsehood at that. I've heard Coca get up on Channel 7 News, where I shared a night with them, and say that LAPD kills a person every week on average. That's 52 people a year. And there is no rebuttal. There is no one saying anything other than just that they're just allowing that mantra. If LAPD put out that much misinformation, I would expect this organization that I'm speaking to right now to have me removed. But yet we have leadership within other activists, which I understand and largely support their underlying values. Not all of them, but many of them. And we have common ground. And we're trying to get that common ground. And they refuse to meet with us. They refuse to meet with anyone, not this chief, but any chief. And they also spew entirely, far too often, absolute lies, just falsehoods. So to that end, in today's social media world, we are challenged, and we are trying to strike a reasonable tone. One of your reporters today is asking us for information relative to, isn't this propaganda? Is it even ethical to have a media relations? Aren't you shaping and promoting the department's view on this? And the whole tone of the questions was already from a sentiment of criticism. And yet I think we live in a democracy that wants law enforcement to be transparent, that wants law enforcement to provide information to journalists, and for fair and balanced reporting.
I want to, as Sue said, circle back to the discipline issue, because I was amazed to see in Minneapolis, in Atlanta, in Buffalo, cops do something wrong, they're fired, you're done, you're out. And here in LA, we can't even get charges filed for 2 years in police shootings. It has taken up to 2 years to investigate by the DA's office. It seems to me that's part of what contributes to a culture where the Metro team can, you know, report people, put them on the gang thing, even though they know they're being, on camera. They know this is going to show to be true, but I mean, to not be true, but no one seems to care. And the culture, we had the beating in Boyle Heights, where the guy, I think Hernandez, and his partner's just standing there waiting for him to finish beating the guy up. When you see things like this, and in other cities they see things like this, and they say, you're fired. That sends a message to the community. We're not going to stand for this. It sends a message to the department. And you can't do that, right? How do you feel about that, and what needs to happen so you can?
A couple of things. I think the Hernandez matter is a good matter. That night when that night that attack happened by that officer, we pushed internal affairs out there, got that investigated. That officer was assigned home. His peace officer powers were removed. I called Miss Lacey myself and said, this is coming. Jason is invited. That's a justice system integrity. We need you in this investigation. You need to see this video. And I believe she acted, she did act, and she resulted in the arrest of him and his prosecution. I can't move fast enough to remove him. The process of administratively removing him is convoluted. We did fire 18 people last year, 18 sworn members of this organization. But again, the problem I have, I can't bring that out and give examples of their names. And that, in my view, undermines public trust, because everyone believes that no one gets fired in this organization. And that's not the truth. That's not accurate. People may believe too many people get disciplined and some minor infraction that shouldn't be, but I believe that we should have the ability to, and we should improve our ability to streamline the proper investigation and removal of an officer for cause, and that should be the authority of the chief of police. And then we should allow a court or some other judicial review to determine if there has been an excess of authority. But your publisher, you're all leaders. You'll have, as an organization, you'll have disagreements. You'll have substandard employees. Journalism isn't immune from that anymore in other profession. But yet somebody has the ability to fire somebody, and you can hold them accountable. In LA, is too diffused. I do think on police investigations of misconduct, particularly on shootings, the DA's review of them, our effort, the DA rollout policy is to have a decision within 90 days.
Yeah.
And I believe that that's something that we should be expecting our DA to do. And Jackie, I believe Ms. Lacey has improved on the timing of turnarounds on declinations or other decisions. And there'll always be, I think, there's always going to be room for people to debate whether she or her predecessor or whoever is aggressive enough in the sense of criminally charging officers in the use of deadly force.
Well, what has to change? Does something have to change at the state level or here?
So two things need to change. You need to see transparency laws at the state of California change, peace officer bill of rights, confidentiality as far as the department's ability to talk about discipline is severely impacted, that we cannot. So there's that. Secondly, the charter this is a city charter. So this city government here is governed by a charter, which is unlike many other cities. And that is kind of our constitution. And it defines roles and powers of the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the city attorney, the city attorney. And presently, that charter gives me as a general manager certain rights and authorities, but also limits those rights and authorities. And this sprang from the corruption of the 20s and 30s, that police chiefs would hire and fire based on calls from City Hall. And so that was removed. And that reform then has been further, in my view, weakened, because the tribunal was used to be 3 sworn members. In the aftermath of the Rodney King trial and the aftermath of the Daryl Gates removal and Prop F. That was changed. So instead of 3 sworn members of the organization, a civilian was introduced. And that was meant to be so that it wouldn't be the fox guard in the hen house, for lack of a better term. But then most recently, a new trial, if you will, pilot, where the officer, not the department, could select all civilian board to review in place of 2 sworn members. Now, the civilian board should be selected, is selected by the Board of Police Commissioners. And one could say and advocate that the selection of them would be individuals that would not be starry-eyed or easily confused or misappropriate their discretion to give an officer yet another chance, because the only cases they see is when the chief of police says, not only is this serious misconduct, but I believe by the preponderance of evidence that you committed that misconduct, and the penalty for this misconduct should be your removal. So that's what is 51%. That's what is before that tribunal. And now a civilian board member, all of them, can look at that and say, chief, you got it wrong. And not guilty, or we're same, guilty, but we're not going to fire them. We're going to give them an official reprimand, or we'll give them 10 days. And so that process, in my view, needs to change. And it needs to allow the chief, as you say, as you see in other parts of the country, where the civil service protection is not there, or that it's allowed where a department for cause can remove. There's many other agencies in California that the chief remits an investigation, finds guilt, removes the officer, and maybe the city manager is an appeal. But they don't go through this tribunal, this separate process that then limits the hands of the chief as to the removal of an officer. And that is part of this process, but it isn't everything that you're talking about, the culture. But it is, in my view, I'm not trying to grab the entire world here. I think this moment gives us an opportunity. I hope to look back 5 or 10 years from now, and much like we look back at the aftermath of the 92 unrest, and we saw progressive change, and we saw progressive change in the aftermath of the Rampart scandal, and we saw progressive change in the aftermath of the 2007 MacArthur Park melee. As I look to this opportunity for us, not just in policing here in Los Angeles, I'm most concerned here, but across this nation. That's why I joined with major city chiefs on statements relative to not just to George Floyd's death, but to the reform agenda that the criminal justice reform agenda that's been announced on DC. So I'm hopeful there's enough energy in this, but in the midst of the worst pandemic, and I fear the next year to 2 years of economic uncertainty and the destabilizing effect this global emergency is having on not just us, but our entire democracy and across the globe, that concerns me a great deal. That these are very, very trying times, and so I'm trying to stay focused on give us more accountability, recognize the reform that we've been engaged in, quit demonizing law enforcement for those that are engaged in reforms, recognize if we wish to have a diverse workforce, we want to have people of color, particularly blacks, to work in this profession and be part of that change. You can't continue to demonize the profession, because why would people want to come and work? I think Chief Brown from Dallas, who's now in Chicago, said it best: "We're hiring, and I want to hire. This is and I want to hire people that come from the very communities in which we wish to police, because I know that they're going to make us a better police department."
Chief, just to drill down a little bit further, you mentioned the change in the Board of Rights process, and that was something that was a charter change that was done by voters just 3 years ago. So the voters went the opposite way from where you want to go. I want to know if you are working on any proposal to move forward with a rollback of that amendment or a fuller amendment. And also, you mentioned the state side. Are you in touch with anybody in the legislature to amend the Peace Officer Bill of Rights?
So 2 points, Robert. So first, I don't believe it was a charter change. It was an ordinance that allowed it. So it didn't go before the entire people. It was a ordinance that allowed for a pilot, a 2-year study that gave that the council, with the city attorney's guidance and the mayor's support, found the ability to make that change without requiring a charter change.
But Charter Amendment C, the voters adopted Charter Amendment C in 2017, and
but isn't that a 2-year period or a 3-year period?
It doesn't expire in 3 years. It requires a review after 2 or 3 years to see how things go.
So I am in conversations with the mayor. I've made no secret about the belief that we need to improve the accountability of our process and granting the chief greater authority. The November cutoff was, I think it was June 20th. So it's on our radar, and we are in conversations with the mayor's office, or with the mayor, between the mayor and myself, about the need for this reform and how do we go about pulling it together. I also believe the Board of Police Commissioners is, again, not just in their independent report of what happened before, during, and after the civil unrest, but they're also assembling an initiative that will go to look at LAPD for the last 30 years, look at our reforms, but also identify the path forward. And I believe that that'll also be something that will be delivered to the city before the end of the year. That would allow us to identify specifically what levels of charter change and other changes at perhaps even the state level. At the state level, yes, I'm involved with California Chiefs organization, as well as major city chiefs, to talk about federal and state legislative reform. And we are in conversation. And of course, this is not without contention, particularly on sunshine laws in this state versus other states relative to officer misconduct and officers' disciplinary history. And of course, lastly, you've seen the changes recently with greater visibility on sustained acts of serious misconduct, including and then also acts involving officer-involved shootings. So there has been reform in that area that predates the most recent turmoil. But I believe that further reform that I specifically called out here, people may say, well, what more? Those would be huge shifts. Just the ability for an officer's conduct, sustained acts of misconduct, to be known, like in many other professions, and posted, I believe would have an effect on people understanding that there's consequences, both inside the organization, but more importantly, outside. I think there's many people who are under misperception that officers conduct misconduct regularly, and the department just sweeps it under the rug.
I hear you when you say that, you're working, 911 is 24/7, and social work, like for homeless people, for instance, is 9 to 5. But so you get called for a lot of stuff that maybe an outreach worker should be going on. But there are other things in terms of your interactions with homeless people that are points of friction. You are charged with enforcing 4118, which is clearing people off sidewalks. Police officers are supposed to be continuously patrolling outside of a bridge homeless projects. When homeless people start getting housed from under the freeway to comply with this Judge Carter settlement, it's going to fall to police to clear the freeways, clear the underpasses under freeways when that goes into effect. How do you feel about all that? Can you push back against some of that and stop doing some of all that policing of homeless people?
Yes, already we are. You see the 4118, people aren't being arrested for 4118.
But they are being told to move along, aren't they?
Oh, yes. And I think that they are being told to move along in front of your building. And I guess the question is, if they're in front of your home, if they're blocking access to your driveway, or they decide to set up camp on your front yard, what would you expect your community to do? And by the way, then that means that means rather than an outreach worker coming out and saying, I'm sorry, but this is not a place that you, recognizing you don't have a home, let's get you shelter. But let's also find, if you can't, or you're unwilling to do that, let's find an alternative, because you're also imposing on this person's right of their own property. And I think that balancing act that society is doing too often relies upon law enforcement being that intermediary. And I look forward Right now, we're at shelters across the city where more than 300 people every night are in a congregate setting that are homeless. And that number eventually at its height was 26 locations. And I had officers 24 hours a day at each one of those over my objection. But I did it because otherwise we would not have housed at times more than 1,000 people every night, because disaster service workers and rec and park workers and DMH and LASA wouldn't be there. And so the expectations of law enforcement, believe me, I need those officers out of those areas investigating violent crimes, solving the 15-year-old that was murdered last week by a 12 or 13-year-old young man. I need those resources to be pursuing those violent offenders. And yet I find myself with more than 100 personnel accompanying LASA and sanitation on outreach and engagement at homeless encampments. And why is that? Why is that? Because we're being asked to do it. And
By sanitation or by LASA?
By both. And then you'll have rank and file within LASA that'll argue with that. But if Heidi Marsden said tomorrow, you know, Chief, we really, you're good. We don't need you. We prefer that you not be here. We're not there over their objections at all. And why is it the sanitation who goes and picks up refuge every single day, why will they not work? And why is it that the city allows that to be unless there's officers standing there? So the expectations of law enforcement is that we are trying to be responsive. I'm asked, say that in regards to the ambassador program, you know, what's the LAPD going to do to enforce people who are non-compliant with the public health laws? Well, where's the Department of Public Health? Why should we be engaged in this? And what we're doing is saying we're pushing other workers into that space to say, no, please just bring us on the most egregious problems. But by the way, if the city attorney is not going to pursue that criminally, again, why are we even in that space? There's not violence going on. This is a regulatory issue. It's a public health issue, but it's one that you're continuing to put law enforcement in the breach. And then to the outside, look at cannabis. I've been asking for 5+ years for the Department of Cannabis Regulation, right? A city department that is regulating the licensed and unlicensed use of retail cannabis. And the city council designated $10 million last year for LAPD to pursue unlicensed establishments. For 5+ years, I've said, on average, 400 to 500 people retire from LAPD. And many of them, as I can attest, still want to keep working. And they would be perfect to be hired as inspectors that could work for the Department of Cannabis Regulation, just like building and safety has inspectors, just like the fire department has arson or building inspectors that enforce fire code. You don't need a police officer to go into an unlicensed establishment and arrest a young man of color who is frankly just the front office of a back office organization capitalizing on cannabis sales. And yet we're still in that space. And so we have had these conversations in public, we've had them in private, and I look forward to today. I'm meant to be here complaining, but I want to be candid with you that our actions, we're genuine in our effort to get out of this. But I think I would ask this paper to look at the formula, and you're looking at an algebra formula, and there's a left side and a right side, and there's 5 factors on each side. You're trying to address one factor and change the formula. You've got to look at these other components and how those other components set up this system that has this systemic. We talked about it being systemic. So why aren't we looking at our elected officials? Why aren't we looking at other city and county agencies? And why aren't we looking at other resources? And what are they actually stepping into space? I believe, and I've suggested this, if we were to put $10 million into a pilot effort, and we identified 4 corners of an area, and I suggested it to be in South Los Angeles, and Councilman Price or Councilman Marquise Harris Dawson's or Councilman Wesson's district. And you put those boundaries and you establish that we're going to alternate service, and we're going to send, rather than LAPD, we're going to send another contract entity, kind of think like GRID, Gang Reduction Youth Development, those interventionists. If I think if you put $10 million out there, that you would find outreach workers and engagements that would say, we'll do it. And why? Because that's what we have with GRID. We can't, LAPD has to accompany all these resources for homeless outreach and engagement because it's not safe. But yet I've got GRID providers that are making a difference, disrupting gang violence by going in and being a part of neighborhoods to lessen retaliations and to lower the tension. And are they at risk? Absolutely. And maybe 20 years ago, you would never imagine us getting a formalized process of doing that. But I think that opportunity is before us now. And we're ready, and we make these suggestions. This isn't some confidential, top secret conversation, but there is a bit of concern that are people actually going to do the hard work and do that? And how do we unfreeze this moment? And I think part of it is to put money into it. And so let's put, because frankly, that drives a lot. You know, if you had that opportunity, that resource there, I think that there's community-based organizations that would say, let me take that job. Let me try, give me a portion of that money, and let's pilot this out, and let's show what this works. But we also have to be honest, and I look for you to go, when you go look at the Cahoots program in Eugene, you've got reporters up there, is to ask them what happens on those calls, 20,000 calls that they dispatch, if the offender, the individual involved, takes a step towards that outreach worker, or what level of violence does Eugene say, oh, Cahoots, no, we don't do this. We now have a police response. Because I think that what we're going to end up having, I'm hopeful, is we need to develop this issue of no police, and then we have the issue of police, and then it's multidisciplinary team, like our SMART team, where we have people that we have a presence, but we also have a clinician there, and then this body of work, and that's what we try to have happen with HOPE and with these outreach teams. But the criticism, of course, is why are you there? And it's like, well, because that other bucket of no police being there is like empty, or if it's there 9 to 5, if that, and it's not pervasive enough to really deal with the underlying ills.